Ooh, thank you, Roger, our DJ. Welcome, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Thank you for joining us in our. Oh, oh, the chat is disabled. Rod, could you? Oh, would you mind, Rod, turning on the chat so folks could just say what's up? Is
You
that
got
cool?
it.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. My bad, a little technical difficulties, but we're just gonna mosey on through. Roger's gonna turn that on. So please let us know where you're coming from. We're very thankful for y'all to join us for today. My name is Alvin Gilbertino, Student Life and Leadership Manager here at the Skyline College. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We hella appreciate your time. I'm actually gonna be here for a little bit. I'll be joining you now and joining you later, but I wanted to throw it off to hand off our introductions to our new VPSS, Dr. Nguyen Orante, who's actually going to introduce our college lecture speaker, who is also his homie and friend. And here he is, Dr. Nguyen Orante.
Good afternoon, good morning still. Wow, wrong time. Good morning. I have the distinct honor to introduce a homie. There is no doubt in my hearts of heart that after dropping some palabras, critical words, that he will ignite a small fire in each of us. So with that fire, I actually look forward to building with you guys and what tomorrow will be for us here at Skyline. So let me introduce our speaker today. Dr. David Stovall is a professor in the Department of Black Studies and Criminology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His scholarship investigates three specific areas. First, critical race theory. Second, the relationship between housing and education. And third, the intersection of race, place, and school. While theorizing is imperative work, but the actions that follow is most critical. It is for this reason Dr. Stovall works with community organizations and schools to address issues of equity, justice, and abolishing the school-prison nexus. His work led him to become a member of the design team for the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice. Furthering his work with communities, students and teachers, his work manifests itself in his involvement with the People's Education Network. This is a collection of classroom teachers, community members, and students and university professors in Chicago, Los Angeles, and yes, the San Francisco Bay Area, who engage in collaborative community projects centered in creating relevant curriculum. I also wanted to share a few words from a colleague of ours, and this is what he has to say about Dr. Stovall. Stovall is the nicest, most dependable homie a person and community can have. And that is the only that it only can be outdone by his commitment to the cause, his pursuit for the justice condition for the people he has done this work for the past 20 years. That is coming from a local dude from USF, Dr. Patrick Kamanyan. So today's topic, interconnected struggle, engaging the fight against white supremacy around communities. With no further ado, I turn the floor over to Dr. Stovall. Welcome to Skyline.
Man, thank you all so much for having me in the space. And Brother Nguyen, I always want to thank you for solidarity and brotherhood. And I'm really deeply appreciative for you putting us in contact, putting me in contact in particular with Ryan Sam, Alvin Gubertina, and Elaine Francis Arroyo, in terms of being able to talk with folks across communities, across cities, in recognizing what the work is ahead of us. So I want to thank everyone for surviving the three pandemics of white supremacy, COVID, and capitalism. So really putting that into our conversation and really giving us some grace and thanks as we celebrate surviving this, but also recognizing the ones that we have lost, many of them losing them too soon. I say this as we have just lost in Chicago, a mother comrade who has really been important to recognizing the work of educators. And she was 38 years old and we lost her to COVID. So, I mean, it's these things, and it's important to say her name, Michelle Rodriguez. So it's really important to say her name in this particular moment, and for all of us who have lost folks in this moment, who have known folks who have transitioned. I think it's critically important to recognize that. Another thing, I am from Chicago, also known as the land of the Council of Three Fires. It is where 15 indigenous nations created a federation to fight white supremacy. And I think it's important to recognize that that federation was developed to fight the colonial onslaught of Western expansion. So when we talk about these particular spaces, I think it's important to put us into context and really recognizing how important it is to talk about our work in a way that is unflinching and explicit. So if I do not do those things today, then the fault is mine. And what I want to engage us with is really kind of thinking about this thing, interconnected struggle, not as something that is this kind of kumbaya thing, but that is connected in struggle, that is literally part of a practice that you engage where agreements are not always on deck, right? You're not necessarily going to agree with the folks that you are working in struggle with, right? And because we don't necessarily agree all the time, it is important to note those tensions, but also to reflect on those tensions in terms of actually pushing our work forward, in terms of what you all have been doing at Skyline College, in terms of not just the speaker series, but how you all have been even thinking about what does it mean to do this work in not just this time over the last year and a half, but really recognizing how we're connected to a broader history. And I say that because COVID just heightened what many of us already knew. It was the larger white world that was sometimes surprised by this, but many of us already knew this, and we knew this for quite some time. So if we think about the election of Donald Trump into this COVID moment, it's not so much the upheaval, but what if we looked at this moment as a reminder of what America has always been, a land founded on slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation. Now, I say those things not to get folks thrown off, but to really think about them as foundational. So if we live in a land that is founded on slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation, we also must understand the grounding in resistance. So now, because of those three things, we must always take into account how folks have resisted to create something new and different, right? So now when we start to think about these particular forms of slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation, if it's everything from school systems that do not do right by our young folks, or if we think about the prison industrial complex, these are things that are extensions of those three things. And now, in paying attention to those three things and how they affect different communities, it becomes important for us to now think about, and I'll use a quote from Brother Kamanyan, in terms of what have we been dispossessed of? Or in short, what has been stolen from us? And one of those things that have been stolen is our history. And now we must engage in a process of reclamation. And if you are reclaiming what has been stolen, there's a struggle there. And we have to be clear about that, because the broader world would not want you to engage in this struggle, because it calls into question what it is that we're in. So now, if we understand the United States as a place that we're only now seeing, or some of us are only seeing, what it has always been, now the question becomes different in terms of what are we willing to do knowing what we know. And I think when we talk about an interconnected struggle, now that allows us to pair these things and to make sense of these things. And what I want to talk to you all about today is just a couple of historical points, but historical points that I think are often lost. And when we think about the work that you all are doing in the Bay Area, there is some really important practices and processes that get lost in terms of understanding and recognizing the history, not only of the place that you're in, but as a hub for understanding local, national, and international struggle. And when we don't pay attention to those things, now we can further become victimized by white supremacy. Now, let me be clear, and I often start off conversations with young folks in community spaces around our understanding of white supremacy. And I think it's important to put this in a frame that allows us to understand how it operates in our lives. Now, I am making a distinct delineation between white supremacist terror and white supremacy. Remember, white supremacist terror is one part of white supremacy. Folks burning crosses on your lawn, people calling you out of your name, racialized attacks in mob fashion. That's just one form of white supremacy. We have to come to grips with how white supremacy operates broadly, both ideologically in terms of what people understand, know, and believe, but also materially in terms of what they do. So now if we understand white supremacy as the assumed beliefs, views, and values of white, Western European descended, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual Christian males as normal, right, and good, and everything else is othered. Everything else is made strange. Everything else is couched in this word around othering. Everything is couched in being away from. And we even start to think about this because the word normal, now we don't question it, right? So when we say, well, I can't wait till this COVID thing is over because we want to get back to normal, white supremacy says, well, normal has been the problem. Normal has been this space where you have now been subject to these views and values that have positioned you as something else, right? These positionings that have dehumanized you. So now, every time somebody says, I can't wait till we get back to normal, I'm always saying, we got to ask a question because that normal has not been good for a lot of folks. And when we think about this COVID moment, remember, when people of color, largely poor people of color, have not had access to healthcare, now all of those issues that are preventable now come to light. And they come to light because now all of those years where people have not had access to healthcare, this particular airborne pathogen heightens our inability to access the things that could contribute to our wellness. So now when we think about this and we see the death of Black, Latinx, Southeast Asian folks from COVID who are working in service sector industries, we now understand what this is, and we understand white supremacy not as a problem of individuals, but as a problem of structures and systems. And I think when we start to name these things, it also allows us to think about how folks have resisted. Because in too many instances, people start to go into the rabbit hole of victimization. And that's only one part. It's critically important for folks to now think about what are the ways that people have resisted? And more importantly, why have we been kept away from the knowledge of the resistance? Like, one of the questions that I always ask my students is, to what advantage does a system have if you do not know who you are? And one of the answers that my students often give me is, well, it could constantly have you believe that you are someone else. It will have you believe in a history that you have been excluded from. It will have you believe in some instances that you have no history. And now when we think about the resistance, it becomes important for us to name that practice. And when we name that practice, that's when things get funky. So I truly appreciate the committee for inviting me, because in this moment, I'm a lot more used to being uninvited than invited. So praise, praise and bless up to y'all for even putting me on deck in a situation like this to be able to talk to folks more broadly. And when we start to think about this around the interruption of white supremacy, right? And the resistance to white supremacy, now it allows us to see how our struggles become connected. And then in that connected struggle, how do we now start to begin to think about our work in real ways? And when we think about this moment of racial violence, particularly against Black folks, against Latinx folks, against Asian folks, against Indigenous folks, now we have to think about what has been the rationale for this. And the rationale often is that something has been disturbed. And this order that has been disturbed is that now people are calling into question their conditions. And now when people are seeing their conditions as intolerable, they understand that working to change those conditions is the instantaneous next step. So now when we start to think about what it means to recognize what are these untenable conditions, what does it mean to not have access to housing? What does it mean to not have access to healthcare? What does it mean to not have access to viable education? And what are the long-term deleterious effects of this? And now when we start to think about this in terms of what are these trauma-inducing situations that we're in? So now, if we understand that trauma is produced when people feel that they have no control of their situation, where are the spaces that promote this type of thinking and knowing? So now, when we think about school spaces, and you think about this whole COVID moment and remote learning, and now young folks trying to suspend folks, how in the hell do young folks get suspended in their own house, right? So now if we think about the absurdity of the moment, it allows us to say, well, what else isn't here? And more importantly, what are we willing to engage? And with this being 2021, there were groupings of folks across the world who recognized this 70 years ago, right? Hundreds of years ago. And then as people started to travel more frequently across continents and to pay attention to news in particular areas, folks began to organize around this, right? And in 1951, there were a group of Black folks who went to the United Nations and wrote a book called We Charge Genocide that actually laid out lynchings in the southern parts of the United States. And what was interesting in their space, they said that we're here recognizing that Black folks have been lynched, but we also understand that there have been Mexican folks lynched in the Southwest, there have been Asian folks lynched in the West, and there have also been Asian folks lynched in the South. Now, this was 1951, and this group of people wrote this book called We Charge Genocide. In 2014, a group of young folks in Chicago read that book and also went to the United Nations stating that they charge genocide in relationship to understanding police violence. So now if you understand the deaths of Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latinx folks, Southeast Asian folks by the hands of the state in the form of police, we can also start to recognize this targeted space where certain groups are thought of as criminal before they are human. So now, if we begin to think about this, when you think about 1951, 2 years later in 1953, there was a Bandung conference where non-white people across the world met to begin to discuss the parallel structures and concerns that they had as people. And one of the spaces, so Bandung, so this was in the conference 1953 in Indonesia, where Malcolm X and Adam Clayton Powell actually went. And when they had this conversation with folks, often the thing that they said was, we look to people in the United States as the example of resistance. And the thing that's always interesting to me, not just as a sociologist and a researcher, but why do we not have discussions about the Bandung Conference? Why do we not have discussions of the Racial Congress's book in 1951, We Charge Genocide? Why are these things absent from our curriculum? Or as Alison Santiago Cubales always says, to what advantage does it give people to steal your history? And now, when you start to think about this in real time, one of the advantages of not telling you about this is to keep the powerful powerful. And something when we start to understand systems, I think it's critically important for us to understand that systems were never created to destroy themselves. Systems were created to perpetuate themselves and, more importantly, to maintain power. So when there is any threat to those systems, power moves quickly and feverishly to eliminate that threat. And we think about this language, you can even think about the language of police manuals, right? If a police officer is in fear of their life or safety, then their duty and responsibility is to eliminate the threat. And what does that mean for folks on the ground? It means that at any given moment, law enforcement can act with lethal force. And now people are seeing this. So in 1951 and 1953, people were saying this across the world and saying, look, we need to pay attention to this. We need to pay attention to economic exploitation in the form of wage theft, in the form of sharecropping systems, in the form of looking at people being excluded from living wage labor. We need to look at education systems. So this is happening 70 years ago, but we don't talk about it. And then if you think about in you all space, in the Bay Area, in the mid-60s, Black students were organizing at San Francisco State and saying that we need a Black Studies program that is connected to communities, right? So at the same time, the Black Panther Party starts literally across the bridge at Merritt College. And ironically, Merritt College to this day still doesn't have a lot about that in their about page and in their history page. I thought that was interesting. But this thing around across the bridge, the Black Panther Party starts in 1966 at Merritt College. At the same time, 1966, Black students organized at San Francisco State. And one of the demands around a Black Studies program was to make sure that there was a tangible community connection to Black studies. So one of the things when Black students were writing this up, they had a policy, and I got a chance to go to San Francisco State 2 years ago at the 50th anniversary of the College of Ethnic Studies. And they said this, and it was on a panel, and I was just kind of blown away. Think about, for you all who are college students, think about if you were in a major and that major had at its rule that 40% of all your classes had to take place in community space. So literally 50 years ago at San Francisco State, the Black Studies Department had it as a policy that 40% of all its classes would take place in the community. Now, when you start to think about that, and when people started to see this, then other folks started to organize. So in 1968, you got the blowouts in LA. Also in 68, you got Chinese American folks and Filipino folks organizing in the Bay Area. And then you get a grouping of people who saw all of this and started to refer to themselves as the Third World Liberation Front. And I would say for anybody in the Bay Area, it is critically important to do your study of the Third World Liberation Front, because what they were talking about was how the struggles of non-white peoples in the world were connected. And in that connection, you saw the ways where the struggles were intertwined, and you saw some differences. But at any given moment, the clarity was these particular struggles are part of a larger effort to disenfranchise the largest part of the world. So now when we think about our local struggles internationally, think about this. 3/4 of the planet, 3/4 of the planet's population is in 3 places: China, India, and Africa. That's 3/4 of the world's population. And now when you look at that particular relationship, you see how the most populous spaces, in many cases, when we talk about Africa, are also some of the most exploited places, where the people who live in those conditions do not have access to the power that they have actually been extracted from by the rest of the world. So now the Third World Liberation Front, they saw this. They saw the economic exploitation and the fascist governments that were making their way throughout South America. They saw this rise of a neo-colonial space, despite the independence movement in Africa. But when large corporations started to, by way of the state, begin to make their way into newly independent countries. They also paid attention to the struggle for continued independence. They also paid attention to struggle around who had been repressed. So one of the things that was important to the Third World Liberation Front was the study of a person named Patrice Lumumba, who was in the nation of Congo, which used to be called Belgian Congo, became Congo, then became Zaire, and now has gone back to Congo. So now when we start to think about this particular transference of power and what independence meant, and how the CIA, along with the French government, worked against Patrice Lumumba to now defeat his cause and to actually murder him, and now begin to put their own person in play by the name of Mobutu Sese Seko, right? So now the Third World Liberation Front is paying attention to this. And they're saying that the Black Panther Party is right, that the Brown Berets are right, that Yellow Peril is right, that the UFW, who was started by Filipino farm workers, and it's important, that story is important, and it's important when you hear Dolores Huerta talk about who were the people who sparked the work of the UFW. The Third World Liberation Front is saying, we need to pay attention to this. We need to pay attention to how all of these things are connected. And their first thing was to connect folks across the bridge, right? So you got folks at San Francisco State, then you got folks at UC Berkeley. These folks were kind of looking at what does it mean to now think about our struggle in real time? And what does this mean in terms of education, labor, law, policy, and now thinking about how these issues and concerns are tied across nation, across ethnicity, across race, across gender, and beginning to think about what does it mean to engage in a world that is trying to disconnect you from who you are. Now, it's important because this is struggle. A lot of things don't necessarily go in the direction that people expected. And when you think about the infiltration of organizations by the federal government, largely in the FBI under its counterintelligence program, really being used to diffuse what folks were really engaging. And remember, the federal government at one point in time had referred to the Black Panther Party as the greatest domestic threat to exist in the United States. Now think about it. why was a group of people who demanded healthcare, quality education, and human dignity a threat? Because dehumanization was the norm. And when people stood against dehumanization, the powers that be thought that was a threat to the way things were. And I think it's critically important when we think about this current moment. So when people start to stand for Black lives, and when people start to stand for Indigenous lives, it was a reminder to what had happened some 50 years prior, when people said that police brutality is an issue, when people said that gender-based violence is an issue, when people said that education is still an issue, when people said that healthcare is still an issue. And now, when things heightened, when people saw folks murdered by way of video, and then began to ask, when people began to ask, what is it that we're actually in, right? And despite the guilty verdict in the Chauvin trial, does it actually change what has transpired? Remember, Ma'Khia Bryant, on the day of Chauvin's guilty verdict, was killed by police when she was defending herself in a fight. And now the question is whether or not her death was justifiable. So again, we're asking these questions in perpetuity. And now people are seeing it. And I really want to shout you all out in the Bay, because one of the first spaces that I saw around cross-ethnic, cross-racial solidarity was a group of young folks who actually started on a Twitter handle who called themselves Asians for Black Lives. And they talked about the ways in which anti-Black sentiment in their own community had come out, and that they were fighting against that and white supremacy. And I think this really becomes important when we think about the current moment and thinking about anti-Asian violence, and folks from the various BLM chapters who say, we stand in solidarity with Asian American folks who have been castigated, marginalized, isolated, and murdered, right? So now when we start to think about this, and then both Black, Asian, and Latinx folks who supported people in Standing Rock when they were battling for water rights, and even for people who were supporting people in Flint, Michigan, also around water rights, because what we really are thinking about is people who are being the rationalization of them being poisoned, right? So now, again, going back to that baseline of interrupting slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation. Now, I think it's also important to think about some missteps here, because we are not responsible if we do not pay attention to the missteps. And one of the missteps has been around gender. Another misstep has been around sexuality and gender expression. And I think as a cisgender male who has exuded patriarchy, sexism, and all other forms of oppression, it's important for me to recognize how this still operates. So when we talk about gender-based violence, and we talk about the rationales that are used by folks when they engage in gender-based violence, there were women-identified folks who were calling this into question. And those women were wrongly castigated and isolated. And now we're also having this reckoning around what does it mean, right? So it's not just what Tiana Burke was putting forward to us when she talked about the claiming of Me Too, but it was literally saying, historically, we haven't paid attention to this. And when Tiana Burke speaks, she always talks about, we need to understand the struggle that I was bringing light to as a historical one that has been deeply embedded in our movements. And when people like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Pauli Murray were not listened to, when they told leadership that this idea of a charismatic leader is going to destroy you, We have to be committed to disseminate our work across age, race, gender, ability, and sexual orientation. These were folks saying this in the 50s and 60s. And because they weren't listened to, now we're in a situation where we now have to recall and think about what does it mean to embrace a gender politic? What does it mean to understand gender-based violence? What does it mean to now think about sexism and patriarchy? What does it mean when we read the Combahee River Collective and they say, look, our battle is not against menfolk. Our battle is against white supremacy. But we want to be clear that we call things into question if we understand them to be sexist and patriarchal. And that becomes important when we think about the ways in which our struggles are interconnected, because when people are beginning to call these things into question, now it's not just an outward facing thing and saying the things with the world are bad. It's saying, well, what am I willing to do on my end? How am I willing to self-correct? How am I willing to call into the questions to the things that I have been participating in that have harmed folks? And I think in many cases, we start to think about only the outward facing things that we can easily identify to fight against. But the more difficult work and the work that women and LGBTQAI folks have reminded us is that the more difficult work is the inner work. What are the things that we're willing to call into question? What are the things that we're willing to face about ourselves that we may not like or that we have ignored that has resulted in harm to other people? And I say this not as absent of folks that have done this. I say this as someone who has participated in this, right? So now, if we talk about the ways in which our struggle is connected, one of the things is talking about the ways in which we are responsible to each other. And I've learned quite a bit over the last 6-7 years from members of the transgender community around what does it mean to fight for your dignity and humanity in a world that not only does not see you, but has argued as to why it should exterminate you. And now, what does it mean to think about those parallels? So as a cisgendered heterosexual Black man, where are those points of connection? How do I see that their liberation is connected to my own? How do I see that the argument for their extermination is akin to the argument around my own extermination? So now, how do we begin to grapple with those things that we do not know, but now becoming a commitment to become clear about how they are connected, and to also be clear about the spaces where we may not agree, right? So some folks may have more of a class analysis. Some folks may have more of a gendered analysis. Some folks may have more of a racial analysis. Some folks talk about racial capitalism, right? Some folks talk about a carceral feminism, right? So how do we now begin to grapple with all of these things in the multiple layers and being clear about how we engage, and more importantly, what we do not know? And I think that's always the difficult thing when you think about struggle, because you think about yourself as positioning oneself to fight, but this thing is around now. One of the things in resistance and to be able to build something new means that you not only have to know what it is that you're in, but you also have to get clarity around what it is that you are intending to build. And this is always a question when people talk about abolition. People often miss the point. The point of abolition is not only to end the systems and practices that dehumanize, maim, contain, kill, and isolate, but it is also, and more importantly, to build something new. And if you are building something new, you are instantaneously engaged in struggle. You are instantaneously engaged in those spaces where you may experience temporary defeats, but that is why it's so important to lean on each other when we fall short and to admit that we have fallen short. And I think it becomes critically important for folks who say that they are doing justice-centered work to be clear about where they fall short. And when we do fall short, the responsibility is, what does it mean to reflect, correct, and move forward? And now, how do we begin to do that? And I think one of the ways to do that is to begin to ask the question, to what advantage does the broader society have in keeping us away from the things that not only lift us up, but affirm our humanity, that ask us very different questions? And again, it's not to romanticize this, right? Not to look at 50 years ago as some Valhalla period. It was tough as hell then, right? Just like for many of us, it's tough right now. So now this thing around really saying, what does it mean to work through that, and how we will not get through this by ourselves? And I think in too many instances, we get caught up in this notion of this one soul leader who's just going to push through things. And that's never the issue. That's never the case. And that's a lie. The issue is, how are we committed to get through this particular moment? And then in working through this particular moment, to what extent are we willing to pass on the lessons from working through this moment to the next group of folks who come right after us, and now who may be younger than us and just being introduced to this type of struggle? So what is the commitment there? What is the commitment to pass on this particular knowledge? And again, not running from it, but running to it, right? And saying that there are some contradictions there. There's some ways in which we appear that still can cause harm. How are we responsible to it? What are we willing to do? How are we willing to call ourselves in to this particular work? And how are we willing to run to it and not thinking about it in ways that are debilitating, right? So when people talk about a fugitivity, it's really around saying, in what spaces do the rules not necessarily apply? And because those rules don't apply, what are you willing to do? And who are you willing to do it with? And how are you preparing yourself for when the opposition comes, right? So it's not about if they are coming. Once you've made a demand towards justice, it's about understanding that they're coming. And you can't fear that. We must recognize it and accept it as it comes and continue to do our work. And sometimes that's hard because the defeats become difficult, right? They become debilitating. We experience burnout. So now, how are we able to sustain ourselves? And I think that's a broader question around thinking about struggle, right? How do you sustain yourself in struggle when defeat becomes so debilitating, or it discourages you from moving forward? And I think this particular moment is an interesting one, because the question becomes, what happens when all the attention to state-sanctioned violence in the form of policing dies down? What happens when organizations are no longer being funded because they fear cities being burned? And what are we willing to do in the meantime? And how do we now position ourselves against that ebb and flow and remain consistent in our work? And again, I'm saying this not as someone who is all-knowing. I'm saying this as someone who is also struggling through this, right? I don't want to push this moment as it's been easier for me, right? That's a lie. It's really been tough. And I've had to figure out ways to be in community with folks that are very different. And in figuring that out, at the same time, it becomes important to process with folks and to ask these questions that are often difficult of ourselves. And I think when we think about an interconnected struggle, we have to see the world facing outward. We also have to understand the world facing inward. And that means being able to ask tough questions of ourselves because we are trying to live differently, right? We are trying to push back on these things that are placed on our lives that are put as normal, right? And questioning that normal, right? So not waiting to get back to it in terms of getting back to normal, but really saying, if normal was the problem, then now what is it that we're willing to do, right? So when people are embracing fugitivity or people are embracing abolition, those are the things that I see from those spaces. And again, not all panaceas, not perfect. And I really appreciate the work of Miriam Kaba, who just released a book called We Do This Until We Free Us, which is really important to me because she is deeply honest about the mistakes that have been made and not having all the answers, but still continuing to do the work. And I think that is where we need to put our efforts when we are tired, when we feel burnt out, when we feel as if there is no way to go, but to ask ourselves, how are we willing to recoup after a defeat? How are we willing to pick ourselves up after a mistake? And now, what does it mean to move forward with intent, fidelity, and integrity, right? So again, it's a long haul, right? It's not about this fast and hot burning thing that we do at the moment, but it's really around thinking about our work long term. And what are we willing to do long term? And I think that's where our work needs to go, right? So let me stop there because I'm much more interested in engaging in dialogue with you all. I hope that my comments have made some sense and that folks can find them useful to the extent that you all are doing your various work. And I really want to thank you all again for having someone like me talk with you all about some of the possibilities in this. So thank you all again. And I know we're going to get into some Q&A, so I'm just letting folks set up for to engage in that exchange. So I can start with this one piece in the Q&A, and this is from Chris Wardell. It says, how do we as advocates for change begin to engage and educate individuals from non-white backgrounds who may experience implicit biases that reinforce white supremacy consciously and or subconsciously in order to deconstruct this ideology, right? And really think about how to really kind of put this in question, right? So for non-white folks who are engaging in this rationale, really having them ask a different set of questions of themselves, right? So I think one of the most difficult pieces for folks to come to grips with when they do stuff that's harmful to other people of color is really saying, who taught you that? Where did it come from? How do we now begin to grapple with that? And more importantly, why do you believe it's true? Right? So when we talk about interconnected struggle, this is when people are really talking about anti-Blackness, right? So what is this position on Black folks and what informs this position on Black folks, right? Or do we even know any Black folks first, right? And then how dangerous these broad-based statements become, like all Black folks do X, all Latinx folks do X, all Filipinos do X. How dangerous is that, right? And because we know that that is not true, how do we now begin to move beyond that space and really kind of ask folks that question? How have you been informed? And then do they feel as if that information advantages them, right? And if it does, who has to be harmed if they are advantaged or privileged in that particular space, right? So I think it's really upon us to call into these questions around sentiment by people of color against other people of color, and then think about largely that we inhibit these particular behaviors largely because we don't know each other and haven't had any contact with folks and have no mechanism by which to talk about what has actually transpired. So I think that really becomes important. And I really appreciate that question, Chris, because that's how we have to begin to address this interracial strife that really is deeply powered by white supremacy, right? So the strategy of white supremacy is to have you hate yourself and hate others who are in similar situations so that you can never figure out a way out of your situation. So yeah, Chris, I really appreciate that question. And this is another question by Jay Nieve. And it's, do I ever experience burnout? How do you handle a defeat or mistake? And truly, truly appreciate that. And do I experience burnout? Oh, yes, without question, right? So with burnout, one of the things that happens if I feel like I'm stretched too thin, or I'm starting to resent being stretched too thin, now how do I pull back and say, okay, here are the things that I can concentrate on and do that are available, that I am committed to, and now that I can do very intentionally. I have to pull back and reflect and be honest with myself around what I have the capacity to do, right? And from that question, that's why it's really important to be in community with folks and in relationship with folks, because you now have to say to the people that you may be working with that you don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do that work at the particular moment, and to be very clear about you experiencing that burnout. And in experiencing that burnout, there's another part to it to say, well, now what does it mean to recoup, or what is your plan? So if you are experiencing burnout, what is your plan for recovery? Right. And that's really around thinking about sustainability, right? So we sustain ourselves because we have created a pathway to recover, right? And I think that's deeply important in my own work, because it's really me asking this question, okay, if I have to pull back from some work, what am I willing to do to recover? And how that's really played out is in my own health, right? So really paying attention to, and this is pre-COVID, right? But paying attention to diet, paying attention to exercise, and really engaging in that as part of the recovery. Because as I get older, I know these things that I could have resisted as a younger person now could potentially kill me, right? So now really thinking about how do I pay attention to those things that are right in my wheelhouse as part of that recovery process. Because I think when we experience burnout, we often shut down in opposed to thinking about, okay, if I reflect on what's happening, now a responsibility of mine to address burnout is to actually think about what that plan for recovery is, right? And recovery of our mental, physical, and spiritual self. But a critically important question, and thank you for that in terms of putting that forward. And this is a question from Nando Peraza. Do I believe that there's an agenda against people of color that goes way back from history? And I think we don't have to think about it as conspiratorial, right? I don't think about it of course there have been plans to dislodge and disengage folks, but I think about it more in terms of how white supremacy operates, right? White supremacy operates to maintain itself, right? And in maintaining itself, it has to identify targets and enemies. So now, where there has been some planning, explicit covert planning against particular groups, now a lot of that planning is out in the open, right? All we have to do is look beneath the surface. So if we think about education, healthcare, housing, employment, a lot of those discriminatory practices are not hidden, right? They're literally ingrained in the way that they function, right? There was a study just done about housing discrimination, right? They literally have created equations in 2021 that still limit the access of Black and Latinx families to housing, right? So, I mean, this thing around really thinking about that, or if we think about K-12 schools or even higher ed, right? We still have these practices and policies that are exclusionary and have operated for time immemorial that aren't necessarily conspiratorial, right? They're out in the open in terms of what it has meant in regulating people. So I don't think about it anymore as conspiratorial, even though historically we've seen some of those conspiracies come to light. But I think about it now as a public policy issue that's out in the open. Folks are literally showing you what they're doing and then saying that is something else. So I think about it now as really paying attention to what those practices mean. And this is when we talk about a structural racism, right? This idea that these things are supposed to be done based on structures that say that if you do certain things with Black or Latinx, Indigenous or Southeast Asian families, that there is a risk, right? Now we have to ask the question around, well, what has calculated this particular risk and how does this come into play? So I don't think about it conspiratorially anymore, but really these kind of outward facing policies that become rationalized around disadvantaging particular groups. So yeah, not conspiracy as much as out in the open public policy, right? If we dare to go beneath the surface, right? This is a question from Tara Amato. Addressing this is easy, but the problem is that most people won't or don't have an open mind. Most Blacks are settled mentally. It's a spiritual bankruptcy. Well, I mean, this thing around, we have to think about how do we begin to think about understanding what struggles are connected, how struggles are connected, right? And I think this is largely an indictment on US schooling, right? So a lot of times people are closed off because of how they have been introduced to the world, right? And we get closed off because we have been regulated in so many spaces, right? So when you think about where I'm at in Chicago, one of the huge issues here is hyper segregation, right? So you got folks who have grown up in spaces who have never left those spaces. So now what does it mean in a space where that's happening and you've had resources removed from schools, right? So before we start to think about people being spiritually bankrupt, we now have to think about what are the conditions that close folks off? And now when we start to think about those conditions in a different way, what do we do to now open folks up to things that they may not have been exposed to? And now how do we challenge each other for the purpose of improving the work? And the reason why I say that is because in many cases, folks will challenge folks just to prove themselves to be right. And that's not what I'm saying here. We need to be clear about if there is conflict, if there is a challenge, now how do we build solutions that has the potential to move us forward? Not so much around thinking about what person is right. I'll give you a quick example of this. When we think about immigration, one of the things that we often forget is the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment of the Constitution. Now, the 13th Amendment ends slavery except for spaces where people are punished for a crime, right? So slavery is ended in the United States, every place else except prisons. right? That's still on the books right now. The 14th Amendment is supposed to be due process. Now, we've seen the violation of due process all over the place. And this is from immigration detention centers to folks being killed by knees on the neck, people being shot when they're asleep, right? And then being justified as this being the practice of the law or within the confines of the law, right? In terms of the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment being the right to vote. This idea of certain people's votes are often challenged, or when the Republican Party talks about voter fraud, when there actually hasn't been voter fraud. And then they admit publicly that their strategy has always been around voter repression, because the more folks vote, the more people that vote, the more disadvantaged they become as a party, right? So they've said this, but again, we have to get beyond the corporate news cycle to begin to ask these questions. So now when folks talk about someone being declared quote unquote illegal, according to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that particular violation is happening to a lot more folks than we pay attention to. So again, those are spaces of solidarity. Those are spaces where we can see that this claim of illegality is one that is deeply fraught, but also deeply ingrained in the policies and laws of the day, right? So really kind of thinking about, that's that notion of interconnectedness around saying that all the issues aren't necessarily the same, but there's some deep connections here that we need to pay attention to. But I think that thing around that kind of opens us up to see things differently, right? This is a question from Liza Erpello. I'm grateful that I belong to an academic community where I can have these types of conversations with my students and colleagues, but how do I begin these conversations with my family, particularly my immigrant parents and immediate family members who know I will resist having them, right? Again, Liza, thank you so much for even stating this, right? Because that is the issue. How do we talk about this with the folks that we care about and love, right? And I feel you, right? those family gatherings where they say to me, "Oh, here Stovall is, there he is talking that shit," right? But in the same time, you say, "Well, look, there's a different way to think about this, and we got to ask some tough questions that we may not be prepared to answer here, right?" So it's not about demeaning folks, but it's saying, "Look, there's some issues here that we can't run from." And when we make those broad-based statements about particular groups of people, it's dangerous. And in fact, it's so dangerous that it can justify their death. And now if we think about that differently, and it's cool, it's okay to disagree, but where you make your stance is, there are some different views on this, right? And there's not just one way of thinking about this. Right. And now, how do we begin to understand the process of agreeing to disagree, but also recognizing where we are justifying harm to other people? Right. And that's a different type of conversation, but one that I think is critical, right? Because again, we can have all this outward facing commitment to struggle, but it's a whole different thing when you're talking to your family, right? And that, I would argue, is really the test of our commitment, right? The test of our commitment is how we talk to the folks that we care about, who raised us, that we may depart from, right? I was just having this conversation with my mom, who's not conservative, but at the same time, we disagree about what's happening here with the mayor. So again, how do you have these conversations in loving ways where you may depart, but at the same time, in terms of your views, but at the same time, being willing to take a stance in terms of saying what it is that you are for and why you support those particular things. And again, those are the toughest conversations, but yet the ones that provide us the deepest clarity, I would argue. But thank you so much for asking that. I think that's critical, right? And this is a question from Roderick Daus Magbual. Social media has been a blessing and a curse. It's been a way to enlighten conversations, but also as a way to cancel people out. How do we build long-term relationships with younger organizers and activists when they grow up in this instant gratifying environment? It's difficult to build when we are playing woke Olympics and white supremacy becomes more sophisticated. We potentially divide and conquer ourselves. Roderick, this is critical. And if we do not have an understanding of what it means to get clarity around our work, we will constantly fall victim to this, right? And what practices do we have that state, okay, what does it mean to engage in something, and how do we live in recognition of harm that may have been committed, right? Because I think there's a couple of layers here. Sometimes you have spaces where there are things that have gone on for years and have not been brought to the fold. When those things are brought to the fold, now you bring them into question and say, look, we have to stop this particular behavior. We have to stop these practices because they've gone on for too long. In other instances where people have had disagreements and now the disagreements has come out in these claims to cancel folks or what have you, we have to now say, look, how do we understand harm reduction and then recovery for the person who has done the harm? And this becomes a tougher thing to deal with because now it puts your transformative justice practices in real play. And what are we willing to do to think about the folks who have engaged this, and what claims do we now have to not only address the harm that has been committed, but to really think about what practices allow us to live restoratively in a practice that the person lives in recognition of the harm, but we have now agreed upon what will be done to not only address the harm, but also move in a way that makes it much more difficult for that harm to happen. Now, there's even a third part to this. If the person who has been harmed wishes for a practice that may not be in tune with what people may view to be restorative, that's another issue that we have to engage. And we may not have the answer for that. And I think this is what, thanks so much for this, Roger, because these are these very difficult and real questions that sometimes in the end, we don't have a good answer for. But I think really thinking about how do we, and reminding young folks, well, how do we reduce harm? And then what accounts for our recovery, right? And that's a tougher thing to engage. One of the longtime comrades out in the Bay Area, Farima Porkhorshid, really does, I think, a very worthwhile and challenging practice in terms of transformative justice and saying, you know, what does it mean to not just reduce harm, but to live in recognition of that harm while working to live differently, right? And that's a tough thing to do. But again, I agree with you that, you know, the woke Olympics is something that we have to contend with, right? And it's not about, you know, saying I'm more woke or I'm more oppressed, right? It's really around saying, okay, what are we willing to do to think about the reduction of harm and actually living differently? And what are we willing to put into place to see that we can actually do that, right? That, to me, is the hard work. And it's a challenge for young folks because, you know, everything is just so instant, right? You can post something, have 1,000 hits in 2 minutes, right? So this thing around really challenging folks to think backwards in terms of Okay, is this something that is going on for a long time that we need to bring into the fold to end it? Or is it something that we can address with a practice intended to reducing harm? Or what do we do to honor the issues and concerns of the person who has been harmed, right? And I say this to you as, you know, where many of the practices that I've engaged in have gone well with redress, and then others, they have not, right? And I think it's important to live in recognition of that, but that real work in terms of that. So thanks so much, Roderick, for that, right? Let me do this real quick. I see that that some folks may not be able to get on the Q&A, but I got something here in the chat, which is all good. And this is from Anthony Tran. As an aspiring public policymaker, what factors and perspectives should I take into account to improve my worldview to better empathize with and serve a larger community? Excellent question. This is always about centering the issues and concerns of those who have been marginalized. That is something that public policy rarely does. Public policy often seeks to provide some type of middle ground. But if you're thinking about doing this in a way that is transformative, it's really around saying, who has been excluded? What has been the terms and rationales of their exclusion? And now, what are we willing to do given that they have been excluded, right? So here in Chicago, in 2013, the summer of 2013, 50 schools were closed. And in 2021, we're seeing the residuals of this, right? And we still have these schools that are small, sparsely populated, that have been totally devoid of resources. So now, if we talk about things like equity, what does it mean to start with those who have been the most excluded? And to have that as a practice. So if we're talking about equity, where have resources been removed? And we're going to start with those places. I think that's a really important practice when we talk about thinking about equity, when we think about doing work in a way that is against the norm of trying to build some middle ground, right? If we're serious about this, we say, well, no, we got to start with the people who've been excluded. And if we start with the people who are going to be excluded, who have been excluded, now the work looks different. But I think that's an important starting point. And you're starting to see some folks do that across the country. This is when the city of Minneapolis decided to divert some fundings that were going to go to police that now go to counselors, or in cities like Portland where drug possession has been decriminalized, right? So it's not about putting folks in jail, but really saying, okay, what are viable treatment options, right? So now thinking about this in different ways, or we got an omnibus bill here in Illinois that's talking about what does it mean in school spaces to recognize white supremacy and to really think about the ways in which our work addresses those who have been excluded. So again, a real way to kind of think about how we begin to envision our work. But thank you for that question, because it's, again, really around pushing the envelope around who has been excluded and now challenging the rationales for their exclusion. Man, let me see, I'm gonna check back. Oh, and this is from Tara Amato. Since Trump has exposed his hatred and the hatred of others towards people that are shade darker or of a different ethnicity, what do you think the government will do now? Well, definitely, and thanks for that question, Tara. Definitely, we won't see from the Biden administration what we saw from Trump. But what we will see, I think, is this space where we start to get back to more rationalization around police reform in opposed to questioning the broader actions and purposing of police. We'll also see this thing around education, I would argue, go in a direction that potentially could support more charters, more capital investment from corporations, which we've seen has not done right by those who have traditionally been excluded. We will see a bunch of middle ground policies that won't necessarily get to the issue. And we'll also see a burgeoning and a rise of hatred and sentiment, I think, that will arise from the political class, right? So now that Trump has been defeated, his minions will begin to organize in ways that are more hostile and potentially more violent. And I think it's really upon us to pay attention to that. The sentiment supporting Trump has not gone away. It's just in hibernation. So we really need to be clear about the fact that it has not gone away. Remember, 74 million people voted for this cat, right? So now we need to put that on deck. And really, it really speaks to how folks view things like race, ethnicity, age, ability, sexual orientation, gender expression, and the attacks against this, right? So it's not a moment to let your guard down, right? But it's really around thinking about not just what comes next, but expecting it to come in particular ways. But I think it's an important question to ask, right? Because a lot of folks think that they can breathe, that now stuff is going to be right for folks. And history tells me that that's not necessarily how the US government has worked, right? Especially when you talk about issues of justice for communities that have historically been isolated and marginalized. Yeah, but an important question, right? So we still need to pay attention, head up, eyes open. It's critically important, especially now when we feel as if we're experiencing some form of reprieve. Okay, there's a question from Alan Ocampo. What is an example of critical joy that I've recently experienced in this work? Thank you so much, Alan, for that question, because for me, the critical joy comes in the form of us recognizing our work, but also expressing a demand for joy. Give you a quick example of this. One of my guys here in Chicago, we were talking about this, and we were doing, he and I do work between here and the Bay Area with the People's Education Movement. And we were talking about like, man, this particular moment has been hard. And he put as an agenda item the word joy. Right. That was just like, damn. Right. So you got the whole thing. Okay. We're going to talk about curriculum. We're going to talk about how we're going to disseminate. We're going to talk about pedagogy. Okay. Yeah. And then he got just that item, joy. And when we got to it, he said, to what do we claim joy right now? What is our claim to joy? What brings us joy? And it was deep at that moment because we had to say it, right? And you were just like, oh, damn. Right. And it was everybody's. So everything from looking at a clear sky, things like the meal I had was good. Some folks were talking about affirmation from their students that they were actually getting what they were engaging about. Right. So all of these things, critical joy for us at that moment came about first with the claim to it, right? To just say, here's how I demand joy in this moment right now, right? And I think that to me was a heavy lesson because we've now made that an agenda item for all future meetings, but at the same time, knowing that we can claim joy, knowing that there's still work to be done. But we have to claim joy to remind us as to why we do this work, right? Truly, truly, truly appreciate that. I mean, it's critical to be able to claim joy in that way. Thank you so much for that question. I needed that myself. Yeah. It's another question from Anthony. How do we address health and education disparities through public policy and social change? Again, it's the same thing, right? First, we have to recognize where the harm is happening. And I think a lot of times that gets politicized. People want to say one group is doing harm, and opposed to saying, no, here's how we've all contributed to the harm. And now thinking about how we begin to put those issues in the forefront, right? So now what we're seeing in some spaces, and I'll just use cities as examples, some cities are saying, okay, what groupings, and we can locate it spatially, right? So geographically, you can locate who has had the least access to healthcare. And then they say, okay, what are we willing to do in those spaces? And COVID has kind of thought about this, made people think about this in a number of ways, right? Whether it be mobile units, whether it be public education campaigns, but really saying, if we think about where folks have historically had the least as our starting points, now it allows us to address that disparity head on. And what I actually saw in some of the medical communities here in Chicago, there was a group of doctors who were very clear about the current COVID moment. And they were like, look, I need to be clear as a physician that communities of color should be distrustful of my practices. Right? And I was like, damn, like that. When they said that, I was like, okay, they're serious about this. And they're saying, look, our accountability has to be in a thorough answering of their questions, transparent information in different languages other than English, and now stating what this thing does and having a feedback loop for any future questions, right? So they said that as a group of physicians, but I think that's an example of that recognition that things haven't gone well in certain spaces. And here's what redress would look like, right? I think those things around really kind of positioning it in that way, right? Around, again, the marginalized are the center of our analysis, in opposed to the folks we get to last. Oh, we got one more in Q&A. Okay, this is from Kylie Michael Valoran. All right, how do you handle families that resent you for the way you think and what you support? Yeah, so it's a real question, and thank you for that, because sometimes it's really around asking the question, if you're experiencing that type of rejection from a familiar space, well, a familial space, now where do you build community with, right? Where are the spaces where you build community? So if you're not necessarily getting it in your home space, now where are the other spaces that you are building community, and how do you build community in those spaces, right? And that's often difficult, because if you're constantly in interactions with that particular space, a tough question could be, now you may have to leave that space to build community elsewhere. And your discernment is very important in that place. And you do not want to do that type of work by yourself. So now it's really around asking yourself the question, where do we build community with folks? And how do we now build community with folks, because you're not necessarily experiencing that support that you need in that familial space. But again, building communities outside of that to make sure you get what you need. Thank you for that question, because that's a real one, right? There's another question from Tara, of former forever student in this world, and I'm also a student at SMCCD in paralegal studies. I was born in Cook County, living in a hospital, raised in Louisiana. In San Francisco, my passion is helping others. Oh, she was just saying, look, oh yeah, making sure. Let me put my, I'm putting my email in the chat. This is the best way to contact me. So yeah, so just give me a hit on email. I'm to Roderick's point, I'm kind of a Luddite, so I don't even have social media, what have you. I figured I can, if I can regulate myself to email, I can make sure that I get back to folks, right? And then this is from Brother Nguyen, said, if I were to make 1 or 2 actionable recommendations to the professionals of Skyline, what, this is classified faculty and administrators, what priorities must we be focusing on reducing harm and developing trauma-informed work? Thank you for that question. I think the biggest thing is now being clear around locating who have been isolated and marginalized. How does our work reach the folks who are experiencing that marginalization and isolation? The second thing, where does that marginalization and isolation occur on Skyline's campus? Who are the people who actually engage in those practices that bring harm? What can you all viably do collectively to address that? Because it's not necessarily kind of just picking folks off and canceling them, but to say, okay, if this is happening, what are we doing to address folks? And you only get to that by having a mechanism where you can get the understandings of students, right? You have a mechanism by way to talk to students about what those issues and concerns are. And once you locate them, now that becomes your focus of the next work forward, right? I think that's critical in terms of identifying these spaces, because it becomes amorphous, right? We just start talking about stuff endlessly, but now what does it mean to target that by centering the issues and concerns of folks who are rarely listened to, i.e. the students, right? I think it's critical in this particular work. Yeah. So again, I see that we're at time. So again, thank you all for engaging me in this way. I hope that the stuff that I was talking about was making sense. And I hope that folks have a good rest of the semester. I know that you all are finishing up over at Skyline. So hopefully all is good on your end, and we'll be in contact soon. Thank you all again. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Stovall. I'm assuming there is thunderous applause for you right now, because you just nourished all of us with your words and your experience. We thank you humbly for everything that you did. If your question wasn't asked, he dropped his email. Please go tap in with him so your question could be asked. Once again, we thank you so much, Dr. Stovall, for nourishing us today with your work and your knowledge and your life. We appreciate you, and know we are leaving this webinar more full. Thank you for joining us today, and for everybody, thank you for joining us today and all the other events we've had. We appreciate your presence and participation. We are looking forward to create and share space in 2021, 2022. We appreciate you all, and have a good day. Thank you.
Yeah.